Hello to all. Dear students, thank you for listening of our videos. The program for this moment is the explanation of the main parts of the reticular formation. We have to say that it's well known now that reticular formation plays a key role in many activities of the body. It resembles a net or network that is made up of nerve cells, neurons, and their fibers, their interconnections. So it resembles a network. As written here, it consists of the network of the neurons, the pericardia, that extends throughout the brainstem and reaches into the diencephalon, into the zona incerta. We will speak about that in the following minutes. And the cervical spinal cord C5. You probably remember that at some sections of the brainstem and also spinal cord, we have drawn in the cross sections in the diagram some groups of the dots and mentioning that this is the reticular formation. Reticular formation is highly characteristic in the tegmentum, not in the tectum, but in tegmentum of the brainstem. And as written here, the neurons exhibit both the excitation or excitatory and inhibitory function. Concerning the architecture, reticular formation forms three columns, three areas. So one is unpaired at the center, the dark brown color. We call them Raphe nuclei, the group of the Raphe nuclei. Then you see on both sides parallelly descending columns, which consist of the yellow zone, this is called medial zone, and the lateral zone, which is in blue. Concerning the medial zone, this is that one. The medial zone is or consists of the large cells. It forms the column. That's why we call it magnocellular zone. While the lateral zone, the light blue one, consists of small cells, parvi or parvocellular zone. When we look at the position of the columns on the left side, you see that the reticular formation has many connections. First of all, it receives, follow please the first blue line, ascending neurons. So we are at the level of C5, so we see the ascending neuron, or better is to say that it originates from the spinal cord as the spino-reticular tract. It ascends and reaches the lateral zone. After synapsing, it sends direct information to the cortex, number one, to thalamus, thalamic nuclei, then to basal ganglia with feedback, to cerebellum, vice versa. Then it receives also information for hypothalamus. So there are so many interconnections, so many long neurons that provide the interconnection with different parts of the centers of the reticular formation. So better would be to see the last information concerning the group of Raphe nuclei. So these nuclei are situated as an unpaired centrally located column, which is involved in many reflex defensive reactions like the fight or flight, as we see also in the pain control, in the regulation of the sleep-wake cycle. So all these activities are fully under control of the Raphe nuclei central column. The next page explains also the actions of the medial zone, which consists of large neurons, as we said, the magnocellular, and which modifies the pain stimuli and motor functions of the spinal cord. Then the lateral, the last part, lateral column, the activity of this lateral column influences the correct functioning of the basic vital reflexes. So we have to say that the reticular formation consists of the network which forms also important, very important vital centers. So providing also the control of the vital reflexes like the salivation, swallowing, lacrimation, vomiting, suction, coughing, etc. And these cells provide an important role for of control of all these vital centers, and it, as we see, forms the important vital groups, vital centers, the cardiovascular, controlling heartbeat, controlling blood pressure, and it increases also the heart rate, pneumotactic center, controlling the respiration. Reticular formation regulates also the stress reaction. In stress, it increases the heartbeat, tachycardia, or the same with the respiration, tachypnoe. Then increases blood pressure, and also constriction of the vessels which supply the gastrointestinal system, or urogenital, which are not so important in that high stress situation. And the release also, as written here, the vasopressin and the adrenocorticotropic hormones. Last information, brainstem, because the reticular formation lies in the brainstem, lesions can cause death. So they usually lead to the circulatory collapse and cardiac arrest, so leading to death of the patient. The following part is the cerebellum. We know that the cerebellum is a very important part of the central nervous system. It's well known that it controls the contraction of voluntary muscles, carefully coordinates their actions together with the relaxation of their antagonists. So when we control the movements at any joint, like the elbow joint, we know that the flexors provide the flexion, and at the same moment the antagonist must be relaxed. So this everything is under control of the cerebellum. We all remember that cerebellum is forms 1/10 of the whole brain, so that means around having around 140 grams. It's located in the posterior cranial fossa, and it's attached to the brainstem by peduncles. Peduncles, we remember them. They were drawn in the cross sections as white areas. That means that they consist the ascending neurons passing from the cerebellum to the different parts of the brainstem, and vice versa. The cerebellum is separated from the occipital lobe of the telencephalum by the cerebellar tentorium. Cerebellar tentorium is the name of the foldings or fold of dura mater. We remember dura mater forms the coat covering the brain, lining the cavity, being firmly attached to the bone, and forms also tentorium, which is the membrane lamina separating the cerebellum from the telencephalum. Concerning the basic terms, composition, we are looking at the very simplified scheme showing the dorsal view. So at the center is the unpaired part called vermis, resembling the worm-like structures, vermis. Then there are two paired hemispheres, right and left, and hemisphere is consists of the anterior lobe, as we see, separated by primary fissure, from the posterior lobe, which is larger. There are more parts and more lobes with their specific names. So I mean that at the moment it's not necessary to study all the names. The same is with the vermis. Vermis had ventrally rostrate lingula, then follows the culmen, declive, tuber, pyramis, uvula, etc. So I mean that this is again not so important. But what is important is to remember the flocculonodular lobe, which is the terminal one, and this is important to remember the names according to the developmental and functional classification of cerebellum. So we are looking now at the developmental and functional classification of the parts of cerebellum. So cerebellum consists of three different parts. Number one is the archicerebellum. Archicerebellum is also called vestibulocerebellum, which deals with the maintenance of the equilibrium. So this is phylogenetically the oldest portion, and this is well known that the archicerebellum is directly connected with the vestibular system. That's why it's also called vestibulocerebellum. We see that flocculonodular lobe is the part of this archicerebellum. In yellow, we remember that yellowish portion was the main part of the vermis, is called paleocerebellum or also spinocerebellum, which is connected with the spinal cord via many interconnections. The spinocerebellum receives mainly proprioceptive afferents from the different parts of the spinal cord, of course, from the areas controlling the movements of the trunk and limbs, important for the postural reflexes. That's why we put here posture. The largest part and the most modern is the neocerebellum. In our diagram, as you see, it was not colored, it's in white. So neocerebellum is also called pontocerebellum because it is directly connected with the cortex of the cerebrum and pontine nuclei. It receives the cortico, you remember, this cortico-pontocerebellar tracts pathways, and if you look at the cross sections of the pons, for instance, at different levels, you see that we have drawn crossing fibers descending from the cortex. That's why we call it cortico, reaching pontine nuclei and passing through the peduncular cerebral or cerebral peduncle to the cerebellum. So that's why we call it the corticopontocerebellar pathway. The neocerebellum is involved in the control of the exact movements. Then we see muscular coordination, speed and force movements, and pontocerebellar fibers cross to the opposite side of the brainstem. So that means that the majority of the fibers are crossed. Looking at the internal structure on the next page, it's typical example of one folia. We know that the surface is not smooth. It contains or consists of the folia, and the folia, when we draw the enlargement in the tail, this is the one folium. They contain the cortex and medulla. So they consist of cortex. This is the cortical portion, cortex number one, and the deeper wide matter medulla, which contains the deep nuclei, as for instance the dentate nucleus. We will see on the next drawing. Concerning the cortex, it consists of three layers: molecular, then ganglionar, and finally granular. The molecular layer contains small cells providing interconnection in the outer layer. That means the basket cells, as you see them in green, or bluish stellate, because they have long processes, stellate cells. And also it contains the short processes, dendrites, of the Purkinje cell. So we look at these Purkinje cells, which are the most important, largest cells of the cerebellum. The cells there, pericardia, are situated in the granular layer, so in the second layer. The third layer is ganglionar, and the third one is granular, which contains the granular cells in the black and also the Golgi cells. We will see how they act. Concerning the general view of the action of the function of the cortex or cerebellum, we start from some specialized nuclei, for instance, inferior olivar nucleus, sending the ascending fibers, we call them climbing fibers, to the cortex, passing through the medulla, reaching finally one Purkinje cell. So there is a relation, one climbing fiber to one Purkinje cell. So you see that these cells or better the Purkinje cells are informed via these climbing fibers from the lower levels of the motor system. But this is not only this type. There are also the thicker mossy fibers following them, reaching the granular layer. The mossy fibers run or ascend from the tracts. We remember them from the cross sections of the spinal cord. That means vestibulocerebellar, spinocerebellar, reticulocerebellar, etc. So all this information ascend via the mossy fibers, reaching the complex of the interconnections, which is called usually glomerulus. And in this glomerulus, we could see the short processes of the Golgi cells interconnecting these glomerulus with the Purkinje cell, but also the granular cells, which ascend into the peripheral zone, peripheral layer of the cortex, dividing into two branches. We call them T fibers. It's logical, which is you see ascending, dividing into two parts. The same is here. We are looking at T fibers, and know that these T fibers cross many Purkinje cells. That means that there is a principal difference between the climbing fibers, which simply inform the only one Purkinje cell, while the mossy fibers much more think to the divisions of T fibers of each granular cell. When we look at the red color, so these are descending motor neurons. So we said that these are the Purkinje cells. They receive the information from different inputs, as we said, and then as the descending axons, they reach the nuclei. We call them also the deep nuclei situated within the medulla of the cerebellum as the first neuron. So that's why it's written here N1. Then follows the second neuron, N2. After synapsing, it descends to different parts of the brain, brainstem, cortex, etc. We will see in the short review of the pathways. Concerning the medulla, we said that medulla is white matter. Looking at the medulla, it contains the deep nuclei. Medulla contains deep nuclei. We said that the deep nuclei formed group. In the previous diagram, that one is the dentate nucleus. This is this one. So first one is the dentate nucleus, which is the largest and contains inside in the opening emboliform nucleus. So dentate nucleus receives axons from the neocerebellum. Emboliform, like the embolus, receives together with globose nuclei or nucleus, usually having 3 fragments, receive the neurons from the paleocerebellum, and finally the last one, the most medially situated fastigial nucleus, receives axons from the archicerebellum. So in general, we could say that nuclei receive axons of Purkinje cells. So all the descending neurons, number one, that means axons from Purkinje cells, must end at the level of the deep nuclei of cerebellum situated in the medulla. No, and finalizing short review of the information concerning the cerebellum, we are looking at the next page, where we see both afferent and also efferent tracts of the cerebellum. Of course, we will explain the review of the pathways at the end of the chapter of the central nervous system of the brain. But here is the excellent chance to explain all the tracts together with the well-defined structure. So maybe that this is the more effective way to show and explain the pathway in very, very simplified diagrams. So looking at the afferent tracks, afferent pathways, the afferent pathways, they originate from different areas. We try to start with number 5, which is the spinocerebellar. We remember, again, looking into your notes on the cross section of the spinal cord, on the lateral portion of the white matter, lateral fasciculus, there are two spinocerebellar tracts, anterior and posterior spinocerebellar, typical proprioceptive pathway reaching the cortex. This is the first one. Then looking at the following, which would be number 4, it originates from the olivary nuclei, so we call it olivocerebellar tract, the same. Then the following is the direct pathway from the pontine nuclei to the from the vestibular nuclei to the cortex of cerebellum. That's why we call it vestibulocerebellar. But now pay full attention, please, to pontine nuclei, which is the complex of the nuclei situated on the basal portion of the pons, and these pontine nuclei receive the information from the cortex, from the motor cortex. That's why we call it motor cortex with area number 4. We will define it a bit later. So the first part is called corticopontine tract, then descending to pontine nuclei. After interconnection, the tract ends at the level of the cortex. That's why we call it corticopontocerebellar. So these corticopontocerebellar pathways are the most important pathways for the coordination of movements, postural reflexes, etc. No, and then there is also number 2, reticulocerebellar. We see the reticular network or reticular formation network situated in the tegmentum of the brainstem. So the last pathway is the reticulocerebellar. These are the ascending or afferent tracts reaching the cortex of the cerebellum. The next one are the motor descending pathways. Very good. So when we look at the same diagram, we see the same structures. What we need for the explanation, number 1, we need the motor cortex of the telencephalon. Then we need the basal ganglia. Concerning the basal ganglia, at the moment we just define the basal ganglia, the group of the gray matter situated in the telencephalon, and the basal ganglia form some groups. And then we also have to know that basal ganglia are involved in the regulation of the automatic and semi-automatic movements. Of course, also the other activities. These are most important at the moment. We need also thalamus. We also know that the thalamus is the main relay and integrative station of the brain for the information coming to the thalamus and distributed to the other areas, but also involved in the motor activities as the feedback system. So we are looking now at the other parts. We need also the structures found in the mesencephalon, red nucleus, and tectum of mesencephalon, we remember. Then we need again the reticular formation following the chain. We need also the vestibular nuclei, and also the olivary complex, and definitely spinal cord, the motor systems in the anterior horns. So just short review of the pathways. So the efferent are in fact based on the same principle. The first neuron always originates from the cortex and ends at the level of one of the nuclei. We have described them, we have mentioned them. So the next neuron number 2, descends to different destinations, starting with number 1, which passes to the thalamus, we call it cerebellothalamic pathways, and then from thalamus you see direct connections to the basal ganglia or to the cortex, motor cortex. So then we speak about the thalamic cortical pathways, but at the moment the name cerebellothalamic will be sufficient. The second group of the tracts is called tectal. That means that these pathways end at the level of the tectum of mesencephalon, tectum, and tectum is connected, as you remember, with the subcortical centers of the visual and auditory pathway, so also involved in the control of the movements. Number 3 is the cerebellorubral, ending at the level of the red nucleus we see. Number 4 is the cerebrovestibular, finally reaching the vestibular nuclei as the feedback. Then we have also another one, cerebral olivar nucleus, ending at the level of the olivary complex. Then following one is number 6. Here is number 6, or cerebral reticular. And of course, from reticular formation, descending pathways directly go to the spinal cord. And finally, the most important descending tract is the cerebral spinal, direct cerebrospinal tract. So together with the cerebral reticular and reticulospinal. So this is the short review of the pathways. We remember again that in the simplified explanation, the cerebellum plays an important role in the voluntary movements control, coordination of the actions of the muscles, then provides the cooperation between the groups of the antagonists, then important for the postural reflexes, for the exact movements control. So whole complex of the motor activities is connected with cerebellum. Thank you for your attention.